Hi, I'm here today to talk to you about Aristotle's Poetics. Aristotle's Poetics is an interesting thing. It actually began as Aristotle's lecture notes. Aristotle, as you know, was a student of Plato, and Aristotle, as you know, was a teacher of Alexander the Great. When Alexander would teach, he would, like most teachers, use his lecture notes. And after his death, his students got together and they said, wow, we love what Aristotle was teaching. We need to collect these thoughts together in one place. So what they did is they found his lecture notes and they put them together. Now, if Aristotle's lecture notes are anything like most instructors' lecture notes, they're not always the most clear to follow, nor are they easily or greatly organized. And we get that sense when we read Poetics. We get the sense that these are concrete thoughts. Each section gives a concrete thought, but the thoughts jump wildly from section to section. We do know that Aristotle was interested in discussing the art of poetry, and more specifically the art of tragedy and comedy. One of the things that we did find, though, however, is while he was going to discuss comedy and tragedy, we've unfortunately lost the comedy part. Somewhere his notes have been lost through the ages. So what we have here in Aristotle's Poetics is a work of discursive prose. Discursive prose essentially defines the thoughts of a culture for others. And Aristotle's Poetics defines what theater meant, what drama meant, what poetry meant. Essentially a story. What is a story? What are the components of story? So Aristotle defines that for us. Aristotle also mentions art and imitation. He says that poetry is a natural expression of man, and by poetry we're talking tragedy and comedy here. He says, and this is in section 4 of the text, he talks about two sources of poetry. He says the first source of poetry is that there's an instinct of imitation implanted in man from childhood. He says one difference between him and the other animals being that he is the most imitative of living creatures, and through imitation learns his earliest lessons. So as imitation is a natural instinct of man, he says part of that leads into him learning. It says, if you go down a little bit more in section 4, he says, to learn gives the liveliest pleasure, not only to philosophers, but to men in general, although their capacity for learning is more limited. So these men imitate, or these children imitate, and people imitate, and they imitate in order to learn things. Then he says the second reason how poetry sprung from imitation. He says imitation then is that instinct of our nature. He says there is also, though, the instinct for harmony, rhythm, and meters being manifest sections of the rhythm. He says persons, therefore, starting with this natural gift, develop by degrees their special aptitudes until their rude improvisations gave birth to poetry. So poetry, he says, is a natural expression of man's imitation, because man is also naturally inclined to rhythm, to harmony, to meter. This imitation essentially converged, this desire to imitate converged with this desire for harmony and rhythm and produced poetry. And then he says from there, poetry diverged into two parts. Poetry took one track toward comedy. Poetry also took another track toward tragedy. He says of poetry, he says that graver spirits, so those people who were more serious, they imitated the noble actions of good men, and that gave birth to tragedy. And he said the more trivial sort imitated the actions of meaner persons, he said composing satires, and that gave birth to comedy. And then Aristotle gets into a little bit more on comedy and tragedy, but then we see all we have left is tragedy.